Okay, so to continue, right here, we finished 6, we're on 7. Bacteria are beneficial in the wastewater treatment process because they break down organic matter. And so remember, that's the secondary part of the treatment. So when it's done in that aeration tank, first the bacteria are going to break down that organic material, then it's going to aerate the actual water. In other words, add oxygen to the water, and then all of the sludge that's left over is going to now drop to the bottom of the tank. That sludge is then going to either be taken to landfill or be used as fertilizer. Okay? You're asked to test the biological oxygen demand or biochemical oxygen demand of a stream in your town. After observing the BOD over a week, you calculate the BOD of 150, which is relatively high. This leads you to believe that the water is likely contaminated with high levels of pollution or waste. Remember that when there's a lot of waste, that's going to produce an algal bloom. The algae die, and when they die, the decomposers increase. Those decomposers are going to use up more dissolved oxygen, so it's going to decrease the dissolved oxygen, but also increase the BOD. Okay? Number 9. What is the difference between a point source and a non-point source? A point source, you can point to the actual culprit. You can look at it and say, oh, that's the oil rig that's actually spilling the oil everywhere. Okay? So point source can be targeted for reduction because you know that it's the one that's doing whatever is happening. It's the one that's actually discharging whatever the pollutant is. Okay? So it's easily identified. You can point to it. In other words, the oil tanker. Non-point source has multiple sources. You don't know where it's coming from. So it's really difficult to target non-point source pollutants. Okay, U.S. legislation that empowers EPA to establish maximum contaminant levels in drinking water. That's the Safe Drinking Water Act. So that's going to be the act that's going to determine or allow municipalities to determine exactly how much lead can be in your water. Yes, there's just a little bit of lead in your water. So there's a certain allowable amount of lead, a certain allowable amount of copper in your water. Okay, it's called the copper-lead rule. So you have to have those kind of ranges, and they're set by the EPA. Okay, and that is due to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So your phosphorus cycle on this side, remember phosphorus is non-soluble. In other words, it doesn't dissolve in water. It's not found in the atmosphere at all. A lot of phosphorus is going to be in rock, and it's a very slow-moving cycle. Okay. The nitrogen cycle, on the other hand, is done all by bacteria. Every single reaction is done by bacteria. The largest reservoir is going to be in the atmosphere. So about 78% of the atmosphere is actually nitrogen. And it's very fast moving. So reservoirs only hold nitrogen for so long. So what do they both have in common? They're both used by plants. So when plants use phosphorus and nitrogen to build their tissues, that's called assimilation. Okay, so assimilation is when plants use nitrogen to form proteins, DNA, RNA, ATP. That's going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. Weathering and erosion, that's rock stuff, so that's only phosphorus. Volcanic eruptions, that's CO2 and sulfur. Okay? Bacteria doing everything, that's nitrogen. All right, which of the following best describes a way that persistent organic pollutants cause harm to the environment? Persistent organic pollutants are soluble in fat, and they accumulate. Yes, POPs are going to accumulate in your fat cells. Okay? They accumulate in your fat cells and fatty tissue. They cannot be peed out. They're not water soluble. They're only fat soluble. So they're going to dissolve in your fat cells, particularly the fat cells of your brain. And so they're going to accumulate or increase in your brain. Okay? And then up the food chain, they're going to increase. So that the highest level on the food chain, your tertiary and quaternary species or consumers, are going to get the most of those POPs. Okay, right in the north part of the Pacific Ocean, we have this circulating gyre of basically just plastic. It's called the Pacific Garbage Patch. So it's mostly plastic. Most of it does come from fishing nets, and it does lead to an increase in what we call microplastics. Microplastics are plastics that are basically exactly what it sounds like. They've been chopped down into microscopic pieces, and they bioaccumulate in organisms' tissues, and then, of course, they biomagnify. So this is a math problem. So you have 5 pounds of MSW, which, by the way, MSW, municipal solid waste, is just trash. What is the approximate amount of generated per day by 310 million people? That's approximately how many people are in the United States. So what you want to do is you want to take 5 pounds of trash per day and multiply it by 310 million, which this is your million. So it's going to be 310 times 10 to the 6, but then, of course, you have to move the decimal over 1, 2, so that's 3.10 times 10 to the 8. Okay? 5 pounds per day times 3.10 times 10 to the 8 gives you 1.6 times 10 to the 9. You can still just put that in your calculator. Okay? Don't forget, you can just put it in your calculator. Number 15, Community Water Supplies. Again, Safe Drinking Water Act, not Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act has to do with ocean, rivers, things like that. It's not things that are going to necessarily go into your body immediately or directly. Okay, but your water that comes out of your sink, any pool water, any fountain water, those are your Safe Drinking Act. As a reminder of how eutrophication works, when there's high levels of nutrients discharged into a water, an ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem, that's going to cause what's called an algal bloom. So the algae just eat up those nutrients, right? But then they die really fast. They don't live very long. So that's going to increase the decomposers. The decomposers are going to use up more oxygen because they're aerobic. That's going to increase the BOD, because that's what BOD is, the amount of oxygen needed for the decomposers. So you're going to have less dissolved oxygen. Less dissolved oxygen in the water causes the water to become hypoxic. Hypoxic means that it's low in oxygen. Since it's low in oxygen, the fish are going to suffocate and die, and we call that a fish kill. Other situations where dissolved oxygen is low, when the water temperature is too high. Remember, high temperatures in water means low dissolved gases. That's just how liquids and gases work. Think about a Coke can. If you leave a Coke can out, or if you pour the Coke into a glass and it's cold, it's still going to be all nice and fizzy. Let it sit there a while to get warm, it's going to get flat because it's going to lose gases. The gases are going to dissolve out. That's what happens when liquids have gases in them. If they get warm, the gases dissolve out and there's less gas. Okay, so less dissolved oxygen when the water temperature is high. Also, of course, when the BOD is high because the decomposers use up the dissolved oxygen. Remember, biological oxygen demand is defined as the amount of oxygen needed by the decomposers. So it says in the graph below, above shows the effect of sewage on biological oxygen demand and dissolved oxygen in the flowing stream. The smallest fish populations would mostly be found at wherever there's low dissolved oxygen. So the little dashed lines is dissolved oxygen. Where's the lowest dissolved oxygen? Well, it's C. Okay? Alright, you and your family planned a weekend retreat at a lakeside campground. Upon arrival, you noticed a Department of Health sign indicating the presence of fecal coliform bacteria in the lake. As an environmental science student, you know, well, that's poop bacteria. You know to warn your family that fecal coliform bacteria is an indication of harmful microorganisms in the water. That's poop bacteria. It causes diarrhea, it causes dysentery, and you get very sick. Okay? Remember, LD50 is lethal dose 50. That's the dose at which 50% of the individuals exposed to the toxin die. The lower the LD50, the more toxic the chemical is. So to figure out what the LD50 is, go to the percent mortality, find 50, move your finger over, go down, and that'll tell you what the dose is that is going to be going to kill 50% of the individuals in this situation. It's about 5.5. Okay? Threshold is where you start to see individuals die. That's the threshold. Okay? 19. Which of the following best explains why top predators can receive 60 times as much of a persistent organic pollutant as their prey and up to 600 times as much of the pollutant as as producers? Here it is right here. POPs accumulate. So that's bioaccumulation. POPs accumulate in the body fat. We just talked about that, of living organisms. POPs are not going to be water soluble. Remember, they're only fat soluble. So they accumulate in the fat. They increase in the fat of a living organism as that living organism grows. And then they increase in concentration as they move up the food chain. That's called biomagnification. Okay? A point source discharges organic waste into a stream. Which of the following graphs best depicts the expected pattern for dissolved oxygen in this stream as a function of distance from the discharge point? The answer here is this last one right here. So this is your discharge. This is your discharge. This is your discharge right here. And so wherever your discharge is, you're going to see kind of a dip in the dissolved oxygen because at some point that sewage is going to feed the algae. The algae is going to bloom. The decomposers are going to increase and then use up the oxygen here. The water is going to keep flowing, so at some point it's going to gather more oxygen and it's going to come back up. Okay? All right. What is e-waste? Electrical waste. Okay, so it's all the stuff that's basically in your phone and batteries and things like that you really ought not be throwing away. You should recycle. Okay, so televisions, tablets, cell phones. Which of the following elements is most likely to limit primary production? Well, phosphorus. Phosphorus, first of all, takes a very long time, right? It's from rocks. So that particular cycle is very, very long. So it's going to be in very small amounts, or it should be. Oh, sorry about that. It should be in very small amounts naturally in ecosystems. Okay, so it can actually limit the size of a population. Okay, particularly the population of producers. Again, this is why we call it the limiting nutrient. Many synthetic chemicals, such as PCBs, act as estrogen mimics. In other words, they pretend to be estrogen. In an ecosystem, these persistent chemicals would have the greatest effect on the following, whichever is the highest, right? Because these are called endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are going to increase or biomagnify up the food chain, and the organism that is at the highest of the food chain is going to end up with the most of that endocrine disruptor. So secondary consumers in this particular scenario is the highest on the food chain. Decomposers is not, that doesn't even count. Ignore that. But your producers, your parasites, I don't even know why parasites is there. Producers and autotrophs are the same thing. Okay. Water quality data for an Illinois stream. All right, so what it asks is, based on the data above for the stream in Illinois, which site is most likely the construction site immediately upstream? All right, cool. Here's the thing. It's asking you, immediately upstream, you're going to have some sort of discharge. And in this discharge, it's from a construction site. What type of discharge do you get from a construction site? Sediment, right? Because a construction site is going to do a lot of digging, so you're going to have a lot of dirt. Okay, so the water is going to be dirty and murky. In other words, it's going to be turbid. Remember, turbidity has to do with how murky the water is, how cloudy it is, how dirty it is. Okay, so this one right here is the site right here with the most total dissolved solids, the most turbid water that probably is coming from a construction site. All right, ED50, that causes 50% of individuals to actually be affected, have harmful effects. Okay, LD50, that's lethal effect. So effective dose 50, ED50, effective dose. Okay, when 50% of the individuals have harmful effects or have some sort of effect, but not death. Lethal effects, that's LD50. For that, in that respect, if we're going to do experiments on humans, we can only do the experiments with regards to ED50 and not LD50 because we don't kill humans. Okay, we can do LD50 experiments on mice, but we cannot do LD50 experiments on humans. We would do ED50 experiments on humans, but even that is a little sus, honestly. Which of the following is most likely the result from the destruction of wetlands surrounding a river? Okay? Yeah, so if you destroy the wetlands, you're going to have more flooding because one of the major ecosystem services of the wetlands and mangroves is going to be to protect the coastline. Okay? So that is going to be a big issue. All right. Of the phenomena that correlate with the data above, the one that's most likely to be the direct consequence of the trend in air travel, so there's more air travel over time, is going to be what? More spread of disease. Okay? More spread of disease. This is going to be one of those things where, you are closer to people, you're meeting different people, disease is easier to spread. Okay? What is the first step in treating wastewater? Well, it's taking all the solid waste out. So all the poop and all the toilet paper. That's the first part. Okay? Number 29. Poses a health risk to humans who eat large quantities of marine fish. Mercury. Mercury. Okay? Lead is going to be, yes, an endocrine disruptor. Both of these are endocrine disruptors, but that's from very poorly treated water, like municipal water. Iron, not a big deal. Radon, remember that's an indoor air pollutant. That's not the same thing. Okay. Number 30, to decrease the likelihood of coastal eutrophication from the effluent, that's going to be that discharge water from water treatment. What should we do? Add to the tertiary treatment a treatment that removes nitrogen and phosphorus. That's not always something that the municipality does because they may not have the money to do that. Okay? So you would add that to the tertiary treatment. This right here is going to be disinfection. That doesn't have anything to do with cultural eutrophication. Breaking down, using bacteria to break down algae, it would be breaking down organic material, and that's secondary. This one right here, secondary treatment removing nitrogen phosphorus. That's not secondary. Again, that's your tertiary. That's adding to the tertiary. But again, it's not always available. Not every city has that particular part. Okay? All right. In the estuary, zooplankton consumes phytoplankton with a large globule of PCPs attached to it. A fish consumes the zooplankton as well as many other zooplankton. The larger fish consumes the small fish, then the gull consumes the larger fish. The increased concentration of the chemical up the food chain is called biomagnification. Okay? Which one is most likely to affect groundwater supplies? Arsenic. Arsenic is actually from the ground. Okay? Sulfates come from acid rain. So that comes from the air. Mercury, that comes from combustion of fossil fuels and biomagnifies up the food chain, and that's going to be found in fish. Lead, that comes from poorly treated water, or poorly treated lead pipes, because yes, we still have some lead pipes. Phosphates, that's not really a pollutant so much as it's just a high level of nutrients. Okay, arsenic is a real pollutant. It can actually make you sick. It causes cancer. So, and oftentimes we may see more arsenic in water if there's a lot of mining going on. Okay? And sometimes when people spray a lot of pesticides that can have arsenic in it. Mandates the restoration and maintenance of the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That is textbook Clean Water Act. Okay, so Clean Water Act is going to protect the lakes, the rivers, the ocean around the nation. Which of the following components of the wastewater treatment plant designed to facilitate the decomposition of organic material is the secondary, so the activated sludge tank. So bacteria break down organic matter. They also aerate or add oxygen to the water. Whatever solid material is still there is going to precipitate out, and it's going to fall to the bottom of the tank. We call that sludge. That sludge is then going to go to a landfill, or it's going to be used as fertilizer. This part right here, UV light, that's tertiary, that's for disinfection. The bar screen is primary, that's in the beginning. The chlorination tank, again, that is also disinfection, that's in the tertiary. And the grit settling is the same thing as the bar screen, that's going to be primary. That's essentially getting rid of the solid material like your poopy and your toilet paper. Alright, this one basically asks you for the nitrogen cycle, even though that's not a part of the Unit 8, that's actually Unit 1. But hey, let's go over it. Remember that N2, that diatomic nitrogen, that's what's in the atmosphere. It's about 78% of the atmosphere. So yeah, that's about the majority of what you're breathing is nitrogen. But nitrogen is so, in this form, it is so unuseful. So it has to be fixed first. How does it get fixed? It can get fixed by bacteria in the soil, or bacteria in the roots of legumes. Remember, legumes are beans. Or by lightning, or by us making fertilizers. But it gets fixed into ammonia, NH3, right? Then ammonia is going to be converted into ammonium, and that's called ammonification. And again, this is going to be done by bacteria. And then that ammonium and that ammonia can be used by plant life to make their proteins and their DNA, RNA, ATPs. We call that assimilation. That ammonium is then converted into nitrite and then nitrate during the process of nitrification. And then nitrite and nitrate are then converted into atmospheric nitrogen. That's called denitrification. Now, before nitrite and nitrate can be converted into back into atmospheric nitrogen, there is a side reaction here where nitrous oxide is produced, okay, which is a greenhouse gas. Now, this can be produced, a lot of this can be produced due to waterlogged soils, so when farmers overwater their soil, okay, and that's going to be kind of the intermediate chemical that is produced prior to the N2. Okay? So you need to know your nitrogen cycle. That is the cycle of nitrogen. Alright. The next question was a math question. It says that the Deepwater Horizon, the one that blew up, released about 53,000 barrels of oil in one day. If one barrel has 42 gallons, how many gallons per day were released? So 53,000 barrels in one day. We know that one barrel has 42 gallons, so one barrel, 42 gallons. We can get rid of the barrels, so we only have gallons per day, so 53,000 times 42 gives us 2 million. Last page. Alright, so open loop recycling, that's when plastic can be recycled into something else, essentially. Closed is when you go plastic bottle to plastic bottle to plastic bottle to plastic bottle. So it can only make itself. Open is when we can take a plastic bottle and we can use it to make something else that's plastic. Okay? Not a plastic bottle. The primary method of disposal of MSW in the United States is a landfill. Okay? The other options are to burn or incinerate the trash, which is difficult and can increase air pollution unless you are able to capture all of that heat and capture some of those pollutants in some way, shape, or form, which is possible. You can incinerate and capture. It's a little expensive, but it can be done. The other option, of course, is to recycle and to compost. Compost is going to be for your organic material, like your food, the food that you didn't eat, your waste food. Okay? Many scientists warn that the increased use of antibacterial soaps contribute to the future health problems. How? Well, because soap promotes the evolution of bacteria-resistant pathogens. Yes. Also antibiotics. So antibiotics and antibacterial soaps are ways that we kill bacteria. Interestingly, bacteria are organisms and they do evolve. They do adapt. So the ones that survive, the very few that survive, will then produce offspring that are now going to be resistant to our antibiotics and our antibacterials. Okay? And then we're increasing those resistant bacteria in our bodies. Okay? So that could be a problem. Plant roots absorb ammonium and nitrate to make DNA, amino acids, and proteins. Okay, cool. What is that called? That's assimilation. Remember, nitrogen fixation is when we take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into ammonia. That's going to be from bacteria in the soil or bacteria in the roots of legumes or from lightning or from when we make fertilizer. Ammonification is when we take ammonia and convert it to ammonium. And that's not we, that's bacteria. Bacteria in the soil do that. Nitrification is when ammonium is converted into nitrite and nitrate by bacteria in the soil. Okay, that is not what that is saying. Ammonium ions and nitrate ions are used to make DNA. Denitrification is when nitrate is converted eventually into diatomic nitrogen in the atmosphere. Now, before that, you got nitrate, and then you've got this side molecule that's made, which is nitrous oxide, which is also a greenhouse gas, and then diatomic nitrogen. Okay? What is the benefit of using water for an industrial process in a closed system in which the hot water is cooled in a tower and recycled for later? It reduces thermal pollution. Remember, when we discharge hot water, that hot water may, if we discharge that hot water into an aquatic ecosystem, it may be out of the range of tolerance of species, so it might literally be too hot for them and they might die. It also decreases the amount of dissolved oxygen in that water because warm water has less dissolved oxygen. Okay? Next one. A man-made pond constructed to hold animal waste. What is that? It's called a manure lagoon. It's often near a concentrated animal feeding operation, a CAFO, or a feedlot. When it rains, sadly, some of those nutrients, those extra nutrients, may be carried by runoff to an aquatic ecosystem. That could lead to eutrophication and a fish kill. Now, what could we do before it rains? We could drain this manure lagoon and use that poo-poo water as fertilizer, okay? But sometimes that doesn't happen. Okay. Mercury concentrations were measured in a freshwater shrimp population in 2 different ponds, one polluted with mercury and one unpolluted. So it's best to draw a picture with a similar food web in each pond. So each pond has a similar food web. Okay, this is what we would call a constant right here. This is a constant. Which quality best identifies the scientific question that would guide this investigation? Well, you want to know what mercury is doing in the polluted pond. Okay, so the question is how much mercury accumulates in the tissue of freshwater shrimp living in the polluted pond? Absolutely. The independent variable is whether the pond is polluted or not. Independent is going to be what you're manipulating, what you're changing, what's different. Well, this one's polluted, this one's not. Dependent variable is what you're measuring. What are you measuring? How much of that mercury accumulates in the tissues of the shrimp. Okay, the control group is going to be the shrimp that are in the unpolluted water, because the control group is there to compare, to see if mercury even does anything. Okay? So that's why that is the answer. You need to make sure that the question or the prediction has both the independent and the dependent variable. When citing a sanitary landfill, which factor would create a situation of environmental injustice? If the landfill is close to people who are poor and cannot oppose it. Okay, example being, remember we talked about the rich Florida Keys people who dump their trash in Haiti. Speaking of landfills, this is what a landfill looks like. Make sure you're able to kind of recognize the landfill. Remember that the landfill is going to have like a plastic liner, but at the bottom it's always going to be built or dug into where there's clay. The clay is less permeable. Remember, clay has very small particles, and so it has a very it's very difficult for water to permeate or anything to permeate through it. So we want clay at the bottom, and then we want a plastic lining, and then we want some sort of kind of piping system so that any of the gooey leach stuff kind of gets sucked out. Okay, and so we have kind of a leachette system. We also want a system that collects the methane. Why? Because methane is a greenhouse gas. If we collect the methane, then we can actually use that methane for electricity. Okay? And when we're done, we're going to bury it in clay, in a clay cap. Okay? Alright, which of the following is best practice to help keep or help protect against inland coastal flooding? Well, making sure that we protect wetlands and coastal mangroves. Wetlands and coastal mangroves are going to be protectors of the coastline. That is one of their regulating ecosystem services. Not only that, but they also absorb a lot of carbon, okay? And they're also going to be kind of like the water pollution absorbing system for our planet. What is the biggest risk to human health? Well, across the globe, it's going to be biological. Okay. The issue in America is going to be a little bit different because we may not have as many pathogens that we're afraid of because we have so many medicines, but that's not everywhere on the planet. Okay. All right.